The wind had a voice in the high country, a low moan that promised a reckoning. It scraped across the two small mounds of earth, each marked with a cross of weathered pine. Elias knelt between them, his large hands resting on the frozen ground, as if he could feel a warmth that was no longer there. His face was a map of hard miles and quiet grief, carved by sun and sorrow. He didn't speak to the names etched on the wood, Anna, Lily, because the wind said everything for him. It spoke of emptiness, of a silence in his cabin that was louder than any storm. He had built this homestead with Anna, had planned to watch Lily grow as tall as the sunflowers they planted by the porch. Now the sunflowers were dead stalks, and the cabin was just a place to wait for the end of the day. A shadow fell over him, not from the bruised clouds gathering in the west, but from a third grave newer and rougher, 100 yards away on the edge of his property line. He hadn't dug that one. He had found it one morning, a fresh wound in the earth. And beside it, a small boy. The boy was there now, a huddled shape against the raw dirt, his small back to the biting wind. He was sleeping, or pretending to, curled beside the simple wooden marker where his mother lay, dust to dust. The boy seemed to take it literally. His clothes and hair perpetually coated in a fine layer of the earth he refused to leave. Elias had tried to speak to him in the beginning, a week ago. The boy had only stared, his eyes vast and empty, clutching a small, crudely carved wooden bird. Now Elias just left food and water on a stump nearby. Sometimes it was gone, sometimes the crows got it. Snow began to spit from the gray sky, sharp and crystalline. The coming storm would be no simple squall. It was a blizzard clawing its way over the peaks. The boy would not survive it. Elias stood, his joints cracking in the cold. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back to his cabin, to bolt the door and let the world handle its own tragedies. He had his own ghosts to wrestle. But the image of the small, shivering form was a splinter in his conscience. He walked over, his boots crunching on the hardening ground. The boy, Samuel, didn't move as he approached. Elias hunkered down, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "Storm's coming, son. You can't stay here." The boy's eyes opened, but they looked through him, fixed on the mound of dirt. He clutched the wooden bird so tightly his knuckles were white. Elias sighed, a plume of white breath in the frigid air. He didn't have the words for comfort. They had been buried with his family. He only had practicality. Gently, but firmly, he slid his arms under the boy, lifting him. The child was impossibly light, a bundle of twigs and fear. He didn't fight, didn't make a sound. He just went limp, his face turned towards the grave as if to keep it in sight for as long as possible. Inside the cabin, the air was warm. A fire crackled in the hearth, a lone point of life in the Spartan room. Elias set the boy on a worn armchair by the flames. He didn't speak again, just ladled some stew into a bowl and placed it on the small table beside him. The boy watched the fire, his small body rigid. The wind howled outside, throwing handfuls of snow against the single window pane. The sound was a familiar lullaby of isolation for Elias. But tonight it was different. There was a second heartbeat in the room, faint and terrified, but it was there. The silence was no longer empty. It was waiting. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a winter sun. The boy, Samuel, remained a silent fixture by the fire. He ate what was given, slept when exhaustion took him, but never spoke. His world had shrunk to the wooden bird in his hand and the flames in the hearth. Elias moved around him, a ghost in his own home. He chopped wood, mended tack, cleaned his rifle. They were two solitary planets orbiting the same dying star of grief. Elias found himself watching the boy. He saw the way Samuel's thumb would trace the carved wings of the bird, a repetitive, soothing motion. He saw the jump in his shoulders when a log shifted in the fire. He saw a profound and bottomless sorrow that mirrored his own. One afternoon, while oiling a leather strap, Elias noticed the boy staring at the small, faded tintype on the mantelpiece. It was the only picture he had. Him, Anna, and a baby Lily, all three of them caught in a moment of sunlight and laughter. Samuel's gaze was fixed on Anna's smiling face. For the first time, a flicker of something other than fear crossed his features. Curiosity. He took a hesitant step closer, then another, until he was standing directly before the mantel, his head tilted. The moment was shattered by a frantic scrabbling at the door. Elias was on his feet in an instant, hand moving towards the rifle propped against the wall. It wasn't the sound of a visitor. It was the sound of desperation. He pulled the heavy door inward. A woman stumbled across the threshold and collapsed onto the floorboards, a drift of snow swirling in around her. She was thin, her face bruised and hollowed out by exhaustion. Her dress was torn, her hands raw. She pushed herself up on one elbow, her eyes wild and searching. They landed on Samuel. A choked sob escaped her lips. Samuel, the boy, froze. His head snapped towards her, his eyes widening. He took a half-step back, clutching his wooden bird. The woman, Lena, tried to crawl towards him, her energy spent. "It's me. It's Lena." Elias stepped between them, not as a threat, but as a barrier against the raw, frantic energy flooding his quiet space. "He's safe," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. She looked up at him, her gaze a mixture of fear and pleading. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He's my boy, my sister's boy." Then her eyes rolled back in her head, and she crumpled into a heap on the floor. Elias carried her to the spare cot in the corner, his movements methodical. He saw the deep gash on her forehead, the dark bruises mottling her arms. These were not the marks of a simple fall. This was the work of a cruel hand. He cleaned her wounds with the same detached efficiency he used to mend a saddle, but his jaw was tight. Samuel watched from his spot by the fire, a small, silent sentinel. He didn't go near her. He just watched. Lena woke to the smell of wood smoke and broth. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The last thing she remembered was the endless snow and the gnawing fear that Caleb was right behind her. Then she saw Samuel, his small form silhouetted against the firelight, and the terror receded, replaced by a wave of bone-deep relief. The man who had taken her in moved with a heavy quietness. He said little, asking only if she could eat. She nodded, and he brought her a bowl of thin soup, his hands calloused and steady. She ate slowly, her eyes never leaving the boy. When she finished, the man took the bowl without a word and returned to his chair. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "Thank you," Lena finally managed to say. He gave a curt nod, his gaze fixed on the fire. "He found my sister's grave," she said, her voice trembling. "I told her to head for this valley. I heard it was safe." The man's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. "Fever took her," Lena continued, the words spilling out now that the dam was broken. "She made me promise. Get Samuel away from him. Get him somewhere safe." She didn't say the name. She didn't have to. The terror it evoked was a living thing in the room. The next few days settled into a fragile routine. Elias worked outside, his axe striking true against pine and oak, the sound a steady rhythm against the silence. Lena, once she regained some strength, began to mend. She stitched the rips in Samuel's coat, darned Elias's socks, her needle moving with a practiced grace. She swept the floor, tidied the shelves, bringing a subtle order to the cabin's masculine austerity. She was trying to earn her keep, to make herself useful, to build a small wall of normalcy against the chaos she had fled. They rarely spoke. Their communication was a language of gestures. He would leave a bucket of fresh water by the door. She would leave a plate of warm bread on the table. He would stoke the fire before heading out. She would ensure it was banked and safe before bed. They moved around each other with a careful courtesy, two wounded animals sharing a den, wary of showing any weakness. Samuel remained the quiet center of their universe. He was still mute, still attached to his wooden bird, but the rigid fear began to leave his small frame. He would sit and watch Lena sew, his eyes following the movement of her hands. One day he followed Elias out to the woodpile. He didn't help, just stood at a safe distance, watching the swing of the axe, the clean split of the wood. Elias ignored him for a time, Then, on a whim, he picked up a small, smooth piece of kindling and began to whittle. He wasn't an artist, but he carved a rough shape, a simple dog with 4 stick legs and a pointed snout. He finished it, sanded it with his thumb, and set it on the stump without looking at the boy. He went back to splitting logs. After a long while, he glanced over. The wooden dog was gone. That evening, as Lena set 3 bowls on the table for supper, she saw the little wooden dog sitting beside Samuel's spoon. The boy wouldn't look at either of them, but his hand rested protectively next to the small carving. It was the first crack in the ice. A few days later, Lena found Elias by the 2 small graves. He was straightening the crosses, packing fresh earth around their bases. She stood behind him, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. "Your wife?" she asked softly. He nodded, his back still to her. "And daughter," the words were clipped hard. "Cholera. Took them in a week." He finally turned to face her. The grief in his eyes was so raw, so stark. She felt her own sorrow rise to meet it. She knew this pain, this hollowing out of the soul. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "My sister," she said, gesturing to the grave on the hill. "She was all he had, all I had left." He looked from her to the cabin, where a thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney. For the first time, he seemed to see not just an intrusion, but a reflection. He saw a woman fighting to protect the last of her family, just as he had failed to protect his. "You're safe here," he said. It was not a comfort. It was a promise. The promise was tested a week later. A rider appeared on the ridge, a dark silhouette against the pale winter sky. He sat on his horse for a long time, just watching the cabin. Lena was outside, hanging a washed shirt on a line Elias had strung. The moment she saw the figure, all the color drained from her face. She snatched the shirt from the line and ran inside, her movements frantic. "It's him," she hissed, her voice tight with panic. Caleb Elias was already moving, taking the rifle from its pegs. He looked out the window. The rider was making his way down the slope, slow and deliberate. "Take the boy," the root cellar. "Don't make a sound." Lena grabbed Samuel's hand and pulled him towards the trapdoor hidden under a rug. The boy's eyes were wide with a terror that was clearly familiar. He didn't resist. He simply disappeared with Lena into the darkness below. Elias met Caleb on the porch. The man was handsome in a cruel sort of way, with a charming smile that didn't reach his cold, assessing eyes. He dismounted, his expensive saddle creaking. "Quite a place you've got here," Caleb said, his gaze sweeping over the homestead. "A man could get lost forever. Some men want to be," Elias replied. His body relaxed, but his hand never far from the rifle leaning against the doorframe. "I'm looking for my wife," Caleb said, his smile widening. "Lena, skinny thing, pretty, but with a foolish streak. Likes to run. She took something of mine. A family heirloom." He paused, studying Elias's face. "Seen her? She might have a boy with her." "Her nephew." Elias shook his head slowly. "Just me here. Been that way for years." Caleb's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, his charm evaporating, revealing the predator beneath. "She passed this way. I know it. And she's a liar. If she told you a story, it's poison. She's mine. The boy is mine." "What's mine? I get back." He gestured to the thin wisp of smoke coming from the chimney. "Smells like bread in there. Not the kind of thing a lonely man bakes for himself." "My business is my own," Elias said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. Caleb stared at him for a long, tense moment. He saw the resolve in Elias's eyes, the lack of fear. He saw a man who had nothing left to lose. With a final, chilling smile, Caleb turned and swung back onto his horse. "I'll be back," he said, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. "And I'll bring friends. You should have just given her to me." He rode away, leaving a profound and terrifying silence in his wake. When Elias opened the trapdoor, Lena was huddled in the corner, holding a trembling Samuel in her arms. "He's gone," Elias said. For now, that night, the tentative peace of the cabin was shattered. Lena finally told him everything. Caleb wasn't her husband by love, but by force. He had married her after her parents died, taking their farm and her freedom. He was a monster, she whispered, who enjoyed cruelty. After her sister died, Caleb's interest had turned to Samuel, to the land the boy would one day inherit. She knew he would destroy the boy. The heirloom she'd stolen was a lie. Her only crime was taking the one thing of value she had left in the world, her sister's son. "He will kill you to get to us," she said, her eyes filled with a terrible certainty. "Then he'll have to," Elias answered simply. The slow-burn tension ignited. Elias was no longer just a homesteader. He was a sentry. He spent the next day fortifying the cabin. He boarded up the back window, leaving only small slits to see through. He checked his ammunition, his movements precise and economical. He was preparing for a war he never wanted to fight again. Lena worked beside him, her fear channeled into a fierce energy. She gathered water, prepared food, tore strips of cloth for bandages. She was not a passive victim waiting for rescue. She was a survivor, preparing for the final battle. Samuel seemed to understand. He stayed out of the way, his silence deeper than ever, his small face a mask of anxiety. He watched Elias handle the rifle, watched Lena stack firewood by the hearth. He watched them become a unit, a desperate family of three against the coming dark. The blizzard hit the next evening, arriving with a terrifying fury. The wind screamed like a banshee, plastering the cabin with thick, wet snow. The world disappeared into a churning vortex of white. And in the heart of the storm they came. 3 figures on horseback, barely visible through the gale. Caleb and 2 hired men. The first shot shattered the fragile quiet, punching a hole through the main window. Glass exploded inward. Elias returned fire, not aiming to kill, but to drive them back, to make them understand the cost of this ground. Lena pulled Samuel down to the floor behind the heavy oak table, shielding him with her body. The cabin became a death trap. Bullets tore through the wooden walls. The roar of rifles was deafening, punctuated by the howling of the wind. One of Caleb's men tried to rush the door. Elias's shot was clean and final. The man dropped in the snow, a dark stain spreading around him. The second man was smarter. He circled around, using the storm as cover, and began trying to pry open the boarded window. Elias moved to intercept him. But as he did, a shot from Caleb ripped through the wall, catching Elias high in the arm. He grunted in pain, staggering back, his rifle clattering to the floor. Lena saw him fall. In that instant, something inside her shifted. The fear was still there, but rage was stronger. She scrambled to his side, grabbing the strips of cloth she had prepared. As she furiously worked to bind his wound, Caleb kicked the door in. He stood there, framed against the raging blizzard, his face contorted in a triumphant sneer. "I told you I'd be back," he snarled, raising his pistol. He fired, not at Elias, but at the lantern hanging from the beam, plunging the room into flickering semi-darkness. His remaining man clambered through the back window. They were trapped. "Now," Caleb said, advancing into the room, "you're going to give me the boy, and she is going to learn, once and for all, what happens when she disobeys me." Elias struggled to his feet, leaning against the wall, blood soaking his sleeve. "Get out of my house," he growled. Caleb just laughed. He lunged for Lena, grabbing her by the hair and throwing her aside. He cornered Samuel, who was pressed against the wall, his eyes wide with utter horror. "Come here, boy," but as Caleb reached for him, Elias launched himself forward. Wounded arm and all, he tackled Caleb, driving him back against the wall. The 2 men crashed to the floor in a desperate, brutal struggle. It wasn't a fight of skill, but of pure, savage will. Caleb was strong, fueled by rage, but Elias was fighting for more than himself. He was fighting for the 2 ghosts on the hill and for the 2 living souls cowering in the corner. He was fighting for a chance to feel something other than grief. As they wrestled on the floor, the second man advanced on Lena, a long knife in his hand. Lena scrambled backward, her hand searching for a weapon. Her fingers closed around a heavy iron skillet left by the hearth. She swung it with all the force of her desperation and fear. The sound of iron hitting bone was sickeningly loud. The man crumpled without a sound. Elias saw it from the corner of his eye. That split-second distraction was all Caleb needed. He drove a fist into Elias's wounded shoulder. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot through Elias's body. Caleb got on top of him, his hands closing around Elias's throat. "You die for nothing," Caleb hissed, his face inches away. Elias's vision started to gray at the edges. His lungs burned. He could hear Lena screaming his name. He could see the terror on Samuel's face. And then he saw something else. He saw the small, carved wooden bird, which had fallen from Samuel's hand, lying on the floorboards just beside Caleb's head. With the last of his strength, Elias let go of Caleb's arms and fumbled for his own knife at his belt. He drew it, the blade scraping against leather, and drove it upward into Caleb's side. Caleb screamed, a high, piercing sound of shock and pain. His grip loosened. Elias shoved him off, gasping for air. He staggered to his feet, knife in hand, ready to finish it. But Caleb was done. He lay on the floor, clutching his side, his eyes wide with disbelief. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by the cold finality of his own mortality. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent. A profound silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the ragged sound of breathing and the soft crackle of the fire. It was over. Lena moved to Elias's side, her hands shaking as she examined his wound. He slumped into a chair, the adrenaline leaving him, the pain crashing down in a relentless wave. She tended to him with a quiet focus, her touch gentle but sure. In the quiet aftermath, as the first pale light of dawn filtered through the broken window, a small figure moved. Samuel, who had been frozen against the wall, walked slowly across the room. He bypassed his mother's killer, his gaze fixed on Elias. He stopped in front of the wounded man. He looked at the bloody bandage on Elias's arm, then up at his face. He reached out a small, trembling hand and laid it on Elias's knee. Then, in a voice that was hoarse and small from a year of silence, he spoke a single word. Stay. The word was a key, unlocking all the grief and fear they had held inside. Tears streamed down Lena's face, silent and cleansing. Elias looked down at the small hand on his knee, then at the boy's earnest, pleading face. For the first time since he had dug 2 small graves on a windswept hill, he felt the ice around his heart begin to thaw. Spring came late to the high country, but when it did, it came with a fierce and stubborn beauty. The snows melted, feeding the creeks until they ran loud and clear. Patches of green appeared on the valley floor, and the sun felt warm on the skin. The cabin was repaired, the broken window replaced, the bullet holes in the walls plugged with fresh-cut pine. On the porch, Elias sat on a stool, showing Samuel how to hold a whittling knife. He was guiding the boy's small hands as they shaved thin curls from a piece of aspen. In Samuel's lap sat a small family of carved animals. A dog, a bird, and a clumsy-looking bear. He still spoke little, but his silence was different now. It was a comfortable, peaceful quiet. Lena worked nearby in a small garden she had tilled and planted, turning the dark, rich earth. She hummed a soft, tuneless song as she pressed seeds into the soil. She looked up and saw Elias watching her, a small, barely there smile on his face. He nodded at her, a simple acknowledgement that spoke volumes. It spoke of shared hardship, of survival, of a future they were building together, one day at a time. Later, they stood together at the edge of the property, looking out at the valley below. Samuel stood between them, his hands holding one of each of theirs. The 3 graves were still there, quiet reminders of the past. But they were no longer just monuments to loss. They were the foundation of this new, unlikely family, forged in the crucible of a merciless winter. The wind still blew through the high country, but its voice had changed. It no longer moaned of what was lost. It whispered of what had been found.